Good day. Over the last few weeks, information has trickled out of the Pentagon that a major war game which took place in October ended in a comprehensive military defeat for the conventional forces of the United States when it was pitted against another great power adversary. Now, it's not yet entirely confirmed which great power the adversary was in this war game, but it is universally accepted and acknowledged that the adversary was in fact China, and that the war game concerned a battle over control of Taiwan. Now, that this war game did in fact take place is indisputable because it has been confirmed by no less a person than General John Hyten, who is the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we are informed that recently, at the launch of the Emerging Technologies Institute, he gave a speech in which he discussed what the outcome of this war game was. And here are some of the things he said. Without overstating the issue, that is to say the American side, failed miserably. An aggressive red team, that's to say the other side, that had been studying the United States for the last 20 years, just ran rings around us. They knew exactly what we're going to do before we did it. We always aggregate to fight and aggregate to survive. But in today's world, with hypersonic missiles, with significant long-range fires coming at us from all domains, if you're aggregated and everybody knows where you are, you're vulnerable. Even more critically, we lost access to our networks almost immediately. We basically attempted an information dominant structure where information was ubiquitous to our forces, just like it was in the first Gulf War, just like it has been for the last 20 years, just like everybody in the world, including China and Russia, have watched us do for the last 30 years. Well, what happens if right from the beginning that information is not available? And that's the big problem that we face. Now, what General Hyten is referring to are two features which the US military has been following and which have been increasingly a characteristic of its methods of war fighting since at least the end of the Second World War. One is a very heavy reliance upon communications, which in effect means radio and electronic communications and data processing networks. The other, which is a product of the very risk-averse nature that the US military has increasingly adopted since the end of the Second World War, has for the United States to painstakingly and methodically build up its forces before going on to any sort of offensive, so that the offensive only happens when the United States feels itself to be in a position of overwhelming superiority. This has been the characteristic of the US military in all of the wars that it has fought since the Second World War. And by the way, it was already a feature of some American military tactics, especially in the war in Europe during the Second World War itself. The Germans are known to have felt, in fighting the Americans during the Second World War, that the Americans were slow, methodical, risk-averse, and therefore predictable in their actions. And this, of course, played into the Germans' hands on more than one occasion. I would add, and in justice and fairness, that by contrast, the US Navy in its war in the Pacific did not wage war in that kind of way. Especially in the earlier stages of the Pacific War, the US Navy was prepared to take extraordinary risks and act with boldness and speed, as it demonstrated convincingly in the Battle of Midway in 1942. However, I digress. There is no doubt today that the American method of warfighting is indeed structured, methodical, painstaking, slow, and predictable, and that this would, in a war against a great power adversary, give that adversary the advantage of surprise. Now, I have to say that this talk about the US military being methodical and painstaking and risk averse has been around for a very long time. I've been hearing much discussion on the part of many people saying that this needs to change, and I can remember these kind of discussions extending all the way back to the 1960s and continuing today ever since. And General Hyten, of course, talks about this problem again and talks about solutions to it. But I'm going to say something which is perhaps a rather bleak view, which is that the risk-averse nature of the US military has now become so much a part of its DNA that I don't think anybody realistically expects it to change. The other thing, the other weakness that the war game exposed and which General Hyten emphasized was the US's over-reliance on sophisticated electronic communications. And here again, this has been a topic that has been much talked about over many years, extending well back to the Cold War, with many people saying that this is unrealistic in the event of a war with a superpower adversary, such as the Soviet Union or Russia or China. Those countries possess enormously advanced electronic warfare techniques, Russia perhaps especially, that in the event that the US military were to fight against such an adversary, it would quickly find that its vaunted communications system, far from being an asset, has become a weakness, practically an Achilles heel. And in fact, there have been reports, often denied, that the US Navy and the navies of some of its allied powers, having been exposed to Russian electronic war techniques in the Black Sea especially, have come out of these encounters with the Russian military facing problems, and that this has repeatedly caused the US military considerable dismay. I would add that recently, in May, the Dutch complained that one of their frigates that was deployed in the Black Sea was targeted by the Russians, and that some of its electronic equipment was damaged over the course of encounters with the Russian military in the Black Sea. Of course, the Dutch don't say what the nature of that damage was, but apparently, and from the nature of the Dutch reports, it was extensive. Anyway, again, we often hear talk on the part of the United States about the need to harden up its communications networks, to perhaps develop methods of warfighting that rely upon them less. And in my experience, despite talk of this nature taking place now for many years, very little in practical terms actually happens. Again, I suspect, because this nature of warfighting, warfighting heavily reliant upon reliable communications, has again become very much part of the American military's DNA. So I don't seriously believe, despite urgent comments from General Hyten about the need to reform the way in which the American military fights, that there's going to be very much difference. It seems to me that faced with the overwhelming problems that the Chinese naval and military build-up along the Chinese coastline creates, the US military is going to respond to them not by changing the overall way it fights, but by looking for a technological solution. And that, by the way, is something which the United States repeatedly does. It tends to look for technological solutions for its military problems. And we are, in fact, being briefed increasingly about what those technological solutions, in the case of a conflict with China involving Taiwan, might be. And it is the deployment by the United States of hypersonic missiles along the island chains near China, so as to enable the United States to launch hypersonic missile strikes against Chinese warships operating along the Taiwan Straits and potentially the South and East China Seas, and conceivably also against targets on the Chinese mainland, where, of course, the Chinese are basing their own anti-ship missiles and their own aircraft, their military aircraft, which would also potentially be involved in any war in the Taiwan Straits and in the South and East China Seas. And in fact, we've had a long article about this in Reuters, which discusses at some length about the kind of work that the United States would be doing with respect to its attempts to try to defeat or at least contain the Chinese in these territories, with a heavy reliance upon hypersonic missiles. And this is what Reuters has to say about this. According to unreleased 2021 military briefing documents reviewed by Reuters, US Indo-Pacific Command plans to deploy new long-range weapons in highly survivable precision strike networks along the first island chain, which includes Japan, Taiwan, and other Pacific islands ringing the east coasts of China and Russia. The weapons include the long-range hypersonic weapon, a missile that can deliver a highly maneuverable warhead at more than 5 times the speed of sound to targets more than 2,775 kilometers, 1,724 miles away. An Indo-PACOM spokesman told Reuters that no decisions had been made as to where to deploy these missiles. So far, most American allies in the region have been hesitant to commit to hosting them. If based in Guam, a US territory, the missiles would be unable to hit mainland China. Japan, home to more than 54,000 US troops, could host some of the new missile batteries on its Okinawan islands, but the United States would probably have to withdraw other forces, a source familiar with Japanese government thinking said, speaking anonymously because of the sensitivity of the issue. Allowing in American missiles, which the US military will control, will also most likely bring an angry response from China. So this is apparently the plan. It's trying to persuade American allies, countries like Japan, Taiwan itself, other Pacific island states, Indonesia conceivably, the Philippines, possibly even Vietnam, to host these missiles in order to establish a ring around China and conceivably Russia, in order to counter Chinese military moves in the East and South China Seas and against Taiwan. And we learn that there's been some pushback from some of these countries in connection with the potential deployment of these missiles. The Vietnamese, and who have been hosting seemingly endless succession of American visitors, the latest one of whom is General Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, have apparently rejected any idea of them becoming involved in these hypersonic missile deployments. But there's obvious pressure on Taiwan and Japan, and though Japan apparently doesn't seem too keen, eventually, conceivably and presumably, US demands will prevail, and it is highly likely we will start to see these hypersonic missiles being deployed in places like Taiwan and Japan, and conceivably other Pacific states like the Philippines and Indonesia. Well, is this deployment going to solve the US's military problems in the Pacific? Well, I think the straightforward and simple answer is no. It's going to involve the United States, or at least so it seems to me, in a missile arms race in the Pacific against the Chinese, who can not only outmatch the US because of their far greater industrial capacity, but who are also able, ultimately, to deploy far more of these missiles, hypersonic missiles, on the Chinese mainland than the United States can ever hope to deploy on an island chain. What it is more likely to do is to increase the risks for the countries that host these missiles of a Chinese preemptive strike against these missiles in the event of a crisis in the South or East China Seas or along the Straits of Taiwan. I would add that there will also presumably be pressure on the Chinese to develop counters to hypersonic missiles. And of course, we have received a report from Russia that the new S-500 missile system, which I recently discussed in a recent video, is specifically designed to counter threats from hypersonic missile systems. Whether it really can is, of course, something that only the Russians probably know, but at least that's what they say it can do, and we would perhaps be unwise to assume that the S-500 cannot. The Russians have sold the S-400 anti-aircraft defense missile system to the Chinese. If American hypersonic missiles start to be deployed in island chains, it's likely that we will either see the S-500 missile system itself being sold by Russia to China, or conceivably, and perhaps more plausibly, the Russians will pass on some of the technology to the Chinese, who will then develop an analogous system of their own. So this is already a field of development where it seems to me that the Chinese have a structural advantage. But it seems to me also that the Chinese have a further advantage, which is that if we're talking about a conflict on the seas close to the Chinese coastline, the Chinese themselves would have military advantages there. Because, of course, ultimately, it is the US Navy whose ships are more vulnerable to hypersonic missiles. The Chinese, obviously, are developing their aircraft carriers and their amphibious warfare ships, but they are probably less dependent on them in a battle, a war, close to Taiwan and in the seas and oceans that are directly join their coast. As I discussed in a recent video, the more likely area where Chinese aircraft carriers might be deployed is the mid-Pacific, and that there, of course, Chinese aircraft carriers, would indeed be vulnerable to US hypersonic missiles. But closer to the Chinese coastline, the Chinese become less dependent on large warships. They would probably seek to use those smaller coastal warships that I discussed in that recent video, which are inherently less vulnerable to hypersonic missiles, if only because the Chinese can probably build more of them than there are hypersonic missiles on the American-controlled island chains which can attack them. And in addition, these small ships would probably be more elusive targets. By contrast, if it is a conflict near the Chinese mainland, it is the United States which, with its large aircraft carriers and its big amphibious warships and its big destroyers and cruisers, which would be more vulnerable, it seems to me, to hypersonic anti-ship missiles, such as the Chinese are known to be in the process of developing. So it seems to me that a hypersonic arms race in the Pacific is a bad idea for the United States. It doesn't solve the US's underlying problems. It provides a technological solution which doesn't work. And by the way, as the Reuters article also says, it probably would only result in an arms race, a hypersonic arms race in the Pacific, which arguably works against the United States also, because it would make the US a less dominant military power in the region than it has been up to now. I cannot reiterate this too strongly, and I speak again, as I always do in these sort of programs, not as a military person, which I am not, and not as a scientist, which also I am not, but I cannot repeat too strongly that the situation that the United States faces in the Pacific is a military one in the sense that it has a military aspect, but it is ultimately political. The United States is drifting into a political, or if you prefer, geopolitical confrontation with China, which is a country potentially more powerful, at least in the Pacific, than itself. There are no technical fixes to this problem, certainly not one that involves hypersonic missiles, or so it seems to me. This problem has to be solved through diplomatic action, and that means understanding and accepting that the Chinese also have their interests and their red lines and their points of concern, and trying to accommodate these. We recently did a program on the Duran involving our friend, Coach Red Pill, in which he discussed at length and with great acuity and insight the fact that the United States and China seem to be drifting into a war along the Straits of Taiwan and the South and East China Seas. And I have to say that the rhetoric that I'm now hearing and these, I think, frankly, harebrained plans for trying to solve this problem by deploying hypersonic missiles on an island chain in the Pacific fill me with foreboding and make me worry that we are indeed heading towards a war which the United States cannot win and which is provoking China to taking further steps like building up its nuclear arsenal in order to protect itself from conceivable retaliation by the United States. This is not merely complicating US strategic problems in the Pacific, it is also causing the United States a global commitment crisis, with the United States finding it increasingly difficult to be strong everywhere as it finds itself facing similar problems in Europe and the North Atlantic and potentially in other places too. What the United States needs to do is to put aside these ideas that these problems can be solved through technological or technical means against adversaries like China and Russia, who are able to match America's technology, that simply isn't going to work. A wiser, better approach is to seek a solution based on engagement through constructive diplomatic action. It means doing things like accepting naval limits, limits on strategic nuclear weapons, those sort of things, and trying to understand the concerns and reasoning of the other side and to come to some kind of resolution with them. That might not be a resolution that meets the maximalist objectives of the United States. It may mean accepting that Taiwan, for example, will at some point become integrated with China in some kind of political way, perhaps not fully absorbed into China, but perhaps retaining a high degree of autonomy as part of a united China, but connected to China politically and perhaps economically nonetheless. It may mean that Ukraine also in Europe may find itself being gradually pulled back into Russia's gravitational pull. But it does not help the people of these countries to make them promises and to give them assurances of American backing, which the United States itself ultimately cannot fulfill. And of course, it certainly doesn't help the United States to make commitments like that, which it too cannot fulfill, and which merely set it up for eventual humiliation and perhaps disaster. Far better to negotiate now, seek solutions, mutually acceptable solutions, and accept that maximalist demands and maximalist positions are unrealistic. So at least it seems to me. If that were to happen, we would at last see, if not perhaps exactly, a detente between the United States and the other two great powers, China and Russia, then at least some form of relaxation of tensions, which would give the United States specifically the time and space it needs to reorganize the many problems that are accumulating within the United States itself. Now, I say this has been a program in which I have focused primarily on what the United States is doing and what the United States is thinking. If the United States pursues the alternative course of seeking confrontation, as we saw with Wendy Sherman's, in my opinion, utterly misguided and indeed disastrous visit to China, then what we're going to see is an ever greater spiraling arms race and more military war games like the one we have just learnt about, which took place in October, which will merely highlight the US's many and increasing military problems. Better sort this thing out now. Better come to some sort of agreement now than later, when the US hand can only become weaker. Now, I say all of this, I make all of these points without any conviction or real belief, genuine belief, that the United States is going to change its policy. On the contrary, what we are seeing is how the United States increasingly is becoming more confrontational and more adversarial in the way it is facing up against China and Russia. But nonetheless, I still think it is appropriate to say these things in the hope that perhaps some kind of wisdom will eventually prevail. And in any event, these things have to be said, even if this sort of advice is not heeded. I'm going to end this program now because unfortunately they've resumed massive building works outside my house. I apologize for the ambient noise over which I can do nothing. I would ask you to check out our other sites, the Duran, and our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU, and Locals. I would say again that Locals is a platform we have great plans for, and thank you again for joining me today, and apologies for the sudden outburst of noise towards the end of this video. But I think I have said all the things I wanted to say. Good day to you.